So I'm Dylan Gaffney, and I'm the Associate Professor of Paleolithic Archaeology at the University of Oxford. And my interests really revolve around working in the Asia-Pacific area to look at long-term behavioural changes and human adaptation to particularly island environments. Islands being one of the many kind of novel and challenging environments that our species and other hominins actually have adapted to as they dispersed out of Africa. So the Pacific was really the final stopping point as Homo sapiens, our species, dispersed out of Africa, moving eastwards into Eurasia, at least before the last glacial maximum. So humans dispersed as far as the Solomon Islands, getting there around 30,000 years ago. This is in sort of Melanesia in the Pacific. And in doing so, humans, for the first time in history, moved beyond the Afro-Eurasian landmass, moving into the islands of what is today Indonesia, which have always been islands, even during the lowest sea level during the Pleistocene, during the Ice Ages. So these movements required really the first adaptations to seafaring, the true sort of seafaring, moving between islands deliberately for the sake of peopling or settling these islands. So if one wanted to examine the evolution of seafaring, you would need to really examine this region initially. So these movements also required adaptations to new types of animals, new plants, as well as the challenges generally of living on sort of circumscribed pieces of land, small islands, meaning a lack of animal diversity, limited land area, and so on. So what we already know about dispersals into the Pacific include the fact that by moving eastwards into the Pacific region, we know our species had to cross several key biogeographic boundaries. So initially the Wallace Line, most famously, and then the Lydekker Line, which is slightly less well known, but it marks the area of Australasian fauna, that is sort of marsupial animals. And so by moving across the Lydekker Line, moving east into the Pacific, people encountered totally unfamiliar new animals and a landmass that would have been radically different to today compared to today. So that is that New Guinea was at the time connected to nearby islands as well as Australia in this massive landmass called Sahul. So although temperatures were kind of compressed by a few degrees even along the equator, and this is especially the case for the higher elevations around the highlands of New Guinea, we do know that these environments would have still retained some of the tropical features that we see today, such as tropical forests and so forth. So people were moving into these tropical islands and continents. And from agent-based modelling of other researchers, we know that early dispersals probably involved several hundred individuals moving back and forth between the islands of today Indonesia and Sahul over several hundred years. So this was this pulse of seafaring, deliberate seafaring back and forth that established a founder population in the Pacific. We know from other sites in the New Guinea highlands that people had, upon reaching Sahul, upon reaching what is today New Guinea, very quickly dispersed from coastal areas up into high altitudes, even sort of subalpine grasslands, which would have been quite cold at the time. They moved into other environments such as arid zones in Australia. And so after initial dispersal, people relatively rapidly dispersed into an array of different ecologies. And there they were using different types of tools such as wasted axes, and the implications for this in terms of how they were making canoes we could talk about. Humans were also hunting a wide array of animals, such as, at least around the New Guinea area of the Pacific, marsupials like cuscus, possums, wallabies, tree kangaroos, large birds like cassowaries, and possibly megafaunal marsupials like diprotodonts, which are sort of large wombats, or protemnodons, which are large kangaroos. So what remains unclear about the dispersal into the Pacific includes the actual pathways that humans followed as they dispersed out of Eurasia into Indonesia and into the Pacific region. So two key dispersal corridors have been put forward, one being the northern route along the equatorial islands of Sulawesi and the Maluku Islands, which are more well known as the Spice Islands, then into Raja Ampat, where I've been working, and into what is today New Guinea. So that's the northern route. The southern route follows Eurasia into places like Lombok and Flores, into Timor, where a lot of research has been done, and then into northern Australia. So the timing and nature of adaptations along these routes has been unclear. We have very little evidence, particularly along the northern route. What evidence we do have, for instance, in parts of northern Australia, suggests that people may have even reached Sahul by 65,000 years ago or more. However, sites along the southern route, places like Timor, date to only 44,000 years ago. So there's this large temporal gap that we need to explain, and perhaps this suggests that a northern equatorial route was a more likely early dispersal corridor. Unfortunately, there's been next to no research along this northern chain of islands. So the Raja Ampat Islands lie along the northern dispersal route, so along this key dispersal corridor for early movements into the Pacific. And these islands, particularly the northern Raja Ampat Islands, have always been insular, always been islands, whereas the southern Raja Ampat Islands were at times connected to New Guinea and Sahul, this Pleistocene landmass. So really, by looking at this Raja Ampat archipelago, we can look at the final stepping stones through what is today Indonesia as people arrived at the gateway to the Pacific zone. And it allows us to test ideas about the very first peopling of the Pacific, where and when people moved, and also how they adapted to island and continental rainforest zones. So our findings show that people were living in the northern Raja Ampat Islands by over 50,000 years ago, possibly more than 55,000 years ago. So really it's demonstrating that this northern dispersal route into the Pacific may have been the earliest dispersal corridor. We are pushing back the evidence for humans living in these Indonesian islands by 10,000 years if you compare the northern Raja Ampat sites to places like Timor, and as well as some of the existing sites on Sahul itself. These Raja Ampat sites really do push back the time period of early dispersal by about 10,000 years. I mean, this study was part of the Raja Ampat Archaeological Project, which I established during my PhD research at Cambridge alongside Indonesian collaborators such as Daud Tanudirjo and Abdul Razak Machap. So there in these islands we surveyed and recorded about 100 sites, excavated 3 key cave sites, and one of these cave sites, Malolo Cave, in the northern Raja Ampat island of Waigeo, is where we did our excavations. So laser scanning along the trenches between Waigeo and New Guinea show that it was always disconnected as an island, even during the lowest sea levels. And our excavations, digging back through several layers to about 1 or 2 meters deep, show that the initial occupation, as far as we know it, was dated to around 50 to 55,000 years ago. And this is direct dating on a tree resin artifact from these early layers. There are complications with hitting what we call the radiocarbon barrier, where dating things and calibrating dates beyond 50,000 years ago is very complicated to impossible, and dating organic remains in the tropics is extremely difficult because of the natural decay that happens around those tropical areas of the equator. So these are the challenges, but what we do have is this sparse but secure fleeting occupation of humans on the islands, associated with a small faunal record of humans hunting the native animals that existed around the island at the time, such as large fruit bats which inhabit Malolo Cave. So understanding the earliest settlement of the Pacific has always been crucial to understanding out of Africa dispersals. For one thing, it allows us to establish the minimum timing of dispersals out of Africa, as well as occupation around Eastern Eurasia and Southeast Asia, and these areas are quickly becoming key topics for debate in terms of early Homo sapiens dispersals, both in paleoanthropology and in archaeology. But beyond that, the island environments of the Pacific allow us spaces to better understand human adaptive capacities. It allows us places to test and characterize the adaptive flexibility of our early ancestors, the Homo sapiens that occupied these islands. And we see that this is really it becomes a hub of the earliest seafaring in history. And so if we want to understand the global evolution of seafaring, we need to look at these islands. You can see sort of these humble but yet sophisticated origins in the sort of islands bordering New Guinea, laying the foundations for many of the later developments in complex seafaring societies around Southeast Asia, even leading into many of today's globally connected maritime networks. So this really was a hub for early seafaring. Beyond that, we're able to examine some of the earliest explorations of tropical forests and lowland rainforests in global history. And this is where humans were moving into the dense tropical forests to collect fruits and hunt animals. And so humans weren't just adapting to these spaces, but they were actively, at least our own species, Homo sapiens, seemed to be doing something different in these spaces, perhaps even what we might call culturing these spaces. And this is drawing from Graham Barker and his team's work in Borneo. The idea of culturing or terraforming these island rainforest environments, clearing forests at times, managing forests, hunting small animals, even sometimes later translocating plants and animals between islands. So this all forms this relatively complex island forested world of interconnections between humans and their environments. So one of the outstanding questions that we have is exactly when humans were moving along the northern route. So we have this evidence from Malolo Cave dating to over 50 to 55,000 years ago, but we have started to go back to this cave and other caves around the Rajamput Islands, pushing the excavations even further down below these 50,000-year-old layers, which we have tentatively promising results for, which we need to do more radiocarbon dating, more OSL dating and other forms of dating to establish exactly when humans were arriving in the area. But in the broader sort of Western New Guinea, West Papua area, a lot of work needs to be done. I mean, in this area, which is much larger than Britain, there are only fewer than 10 published sites with radiocarbon dates. So we don't really know much about the area. If you compare this with Britain, where there's tens of thousands of dated sites, we actually need a lot more field investigations to start to model and understand the nature of people's early dispersals, as well as how they adapted and transformed the environment around northern Sahel. So other scholars, such as geneticists, have also suggested that the Denisovan hominins, known from Siberia and now parts of Southeast Asia, were possibly living around the Indonesian islands or even New Guinea, mixing with our own species. However, we don't have any human fossil evidence for this time period, none whatsoever really beyond 20,000 years ago. So we can't really start to test these ideas without new field investigations. We can't test whether humans were hunting megafauna without new sites where we find, for instance, we would like cut-marked bone with stone tools in association to demonstrate these early hunting of megafauna. We don't have a good idea of how people were constructing, designing their boats, something we probably will never have for the tropics, but we can start to infer things from the stone tool record. And if we can understand the stone tool record, we might be able to understand, for instance, if people were using stone axes for making dugout canoes and so forth. So there's a lot to actually understand that we still yet to understand about the bigger picture of how people were moving into the region and the actual fine details about how people were living their lives in these places.